Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 21, Section 1, Mobilizing for War. And we're going to talk a little bit about the United States during World War II and kind of what led us up into that war and how we fought it not only overseas, but how we fought it here at home. And one of the things that I want to kind of start with here is, we had talked previously about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and certainly our president FDR really was putting up a pretty good front when he went before Congress and asked for the declaration of war. But privately, he was lamenting over the fact that he didn't want to fight a two-front war because he thought the U.S. would probably have to take several defeats until we could get caught up with our manufacturing. But what's interesting is Winston Churchill was really excited about the fact that we were entering the war. And he knew that this was going to be a game changer once we were participating in it. And the reason for that is what we had happening here at home. What did Winston Churchill know would lead to a victory in modern warfare? And he believed in industrial power. And America, and in the back of his mind, was really, kind of a wealth of industrial power. He knew that we could step up the manufacturing, and certainly we were able to do so. So, in number two, how did the industrial output of workers in the U.S. compare to those of Germany and Japan? Our workers here in the United States were 2 times as productive as the German workers, and we were 5 times more productive than Japanese workers. Um, for the most part, within roughly 4 years, American workers helped achieve something that no other nation had ever done in history, and that would be to fight a two front war against two very, very powerful military empires and force each of those empires to surrender. And it all comes back to what was happening here stateside. The fact that we put a lot of people back to work, building ships and building anything that was needed to make warfare happen. Okay, to give you a little bit of a break, we're going to skip numbers 3 and 4. You can cross those out, but I do want to mention a few little things, to kind of get our industry, kind of ramped up for war production. Our president had to do a few little things, and one of them was the creation of the National Defense Advisory Committee. This was committed or created by FDR. Really, it was to merge our government and its demands with business and what they could do. And it mobilized our economy. It gave industries incentives, when we talk about money, to move quickly, to mobilize for this war. And it also convinced many companies who were producing, basically commercial goods to change what they were doing to produce things for the war. So what we're looking at is like companies like Ford or General Motors going in and making things for warfare. So, which industry was probably best suited for mass production of military equipment? That would be the automobile industry because they've been using assembly lines and they had specialized labor force. And what they could do is they could go in and retool these factories, meaning that they could go in, change what they were making from one year to the next when we talk about different models of cars. If you could do it for different makes and models of cars, why couldn't you do it for things that we need for the military? And what's interesting is we were able to do that. So, who created the assembly line for the enormous B 24 bomber, aka the Liberator? It was Henry Ford. Okay, the Ford Motor Company. They were able to do that. And what's interesting is when you look at all the automakers, they were producing things like trucks, jeeps, tanks, but also artillery pieces, rifles, mines, helmets, pontoon bridges. We mentioned Ford created the Liberator, but really a third of all military equipment was created by the auto industry. Companies that were not known for making automobiles, like, for example, the furniture company Lazy Boy, was making some of the things that you need for your aircraft and your your Jeeps and such, like the seats. So, American industry really ramped up. That certainly helped our nation tremendously. How were the Liberty ships different from any other type of ship? Just so you know, the Liberty ship was really the brainchild of a guy named Henry Kaiser. Kaiser had basically been a guy who got into construction, kind of in the 1920s. He actually had a road company where they were going out and surfacing highways and such. And over time, he got the contract to help build the Hoover Dam. Well, when the war kind of happens, people kind of lean on him for his ability to get things done. And he starts a series of different shipyards, a lot of them located on the West Coast in places like California, Oregon, and Washington State. But it's the Kaiser ships that become some of the most efficiently made vessels within the military. And the reason for that is rather than riveting the ships together, most of these Liberty ships were welded together. And I would have to say, maybe not necessarily the best quality ship. The key here is that he could mass produce these ships. He prefabricated them, meaning like part of the assembly happened elsewhere, and then they would bring it to the dockyards, and then they could weld it together. And literally, they were able to get the time it took to build the ship down to roughly 41 days. It's just a little bit over a month, opposed to what it used to take at the beginning of the war was like 244 days. And that's, probably about 10 months worth of time. So to be able to build a ship that quickly, it meant that the United States could be in the game as far as like being able to protect our coastline. And this was important because Germany, in their U-boats for sinking a lot of our ships in the Atlantic, and let alone the fact that we had the fight of war in the Pacific, we needed more ships, and not only us, but our allies needed that. In all, Kaiser built roughly 3,000 ships during the time of the war. 30% of these ships were built of all ships were built in these shipyards. So, what authorities did Roosevelt grant to the War Production Board? He basically gave them the power to set priorities and production goals, okay, for war production. And he also was able to use that board to control the distribution of raw materials and supplies. So, in other words, the military is going to get some priorities. And what's going to end up happening is anybody else is probably going to find that they're going to be rationed for what kind of goods that they can get their hands on. Uh, when we talk about getting ourselves prepared for war, we also have to talk about building up our military. In 1940, okay, before really we declare war on the Japanese and get involved in the war with Germany, our president kind of saw the writing on the wall, primarily with the fall of France. uh, at the beginning of 1940, FDR went to Congress and he lobbied hard, and he was able to get what is known as the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, which was a peacetime draft, which we had never seen up until this period of time. There were a lot of people that were upset about it, but really, with the fact that we had a lot of ships being sunk and the fact that we knew that Great Britain was under a lot of stress trying to fight the Germans. This eventually becomes kind of an important thing to happen. Originally, this would apply to only men ages 21 through 36. That was changed in 1942 to include 18-year-olds. And to be in the military, you had to pass a physical exam. You had to get shots for smallpox and typhoid. You had to pass an aptitude test. And really, what's interesting is 20% of those men who were eligible to go into the military couldn't pass the test. They were illiterate. Not to say that that would kick them out of the military once we get involved, but initially they were not included under this act. Roughly 20 million men were eligible, 50% were rejected, and a lot of it is based on either the physical exam or the aptitude test. And once they got accepted, then they were given a whole bunch of government issued supplies. This is where the term GI comes from, because these are the things that a soldier needs: uniforms, boots, equipment. And then they would be shipped off for basic training for roughly 8 weeks, and then eventually some specialized training. But once these men got in, they realized that our military was kind of lagging behind as far as building up the things that we need. We didn't have enough barracks, and so a lot of men who ended up being drafted ended up sleeping in tents. Okay, until we could build the facilities for them. We didn't have enough rifles because we still had to amp up our production back home. We didn't have enough munitions. There are stories where men practiced throwing grenades with things like rocks. And then we didn't have enough tanks, the armored division side of things. And so occasionally what they would do is they would put a sign on the Jeep and call it a tank. And you would practice with a truck or a tank or a Jeep or something like that, pretending it was a tank. So needless to say, that was one of the things that was going on. But our military at this period of time, by all means, was definitely needing to be amped up. Um, One of the concerns that we had as far as not only production and the military was this idea of equity. Military was segregated based on races. And one of the things that you would probably see if you were on, let's say, a military base is that there were separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate latrines, separate training based on the race that you were. And to end some of that, we have the beginnings of kind of a civil rights movement. And what comes out of this is the Double V campaign. And so the question is, what is the goal of this campaign? And that was to have victory over racism abroad and at home. And in time, the military is going to start looking at our minorities a little differently. Initially, I don't think some people thought that African Americans could be combat troops. And what happens as a result of the Double V campaign is that some African Americans are given that opportunity to prove people otherwise, that they can handle that. And not only them, but when we start looking at other minority groups as well. But also at home, there were a lot of issues with companies that were getting government contracts that were using discriminatory hiring practices. And so with the Double V campaign, basically, if you are receiving government funds, you also have to hire minorities within the workplace. And that, in a way, kind of helped open some doors when we talk about integration, especially in the workplace. Who was the highest ranking African American officer in the U.S. Army? That would be a man named Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis Sr. Um, General Davis, for the most part, would go on to create uh, a group of people that you probably are a little familiar with. He initially started off with the all African American unit known as the 99th Pursuit Squadron, which did a lot of training down in Tuskegee, Alabama. Eventually, they're going to be I guess you could say, merged into a bigger group known as the 302nd Fighter Group. And it's going to be General Davis's command. He's going to be overseeing this group of men. And so, what were their accomplishments? Well, they became the first African American Air Force or Army Air Corps unit, and they flew as bomber escorts in Europe without losing a single bomber in the campaign. And not only were the 100 or 332nd Fighter Group, um, out there proving themselves, but we had other groups that would come about. Another well-noted all African American battalion was the 761st Tank Battalion that kind of was with a little bit of the Third Army. They showed themselves to be a real fight or a real force to be reckoned with during the Battle of the Bulge. But what I think is interesting is if you look at the patches that these men would have had affixed to their uniforms, is the Black Panther. So all you Marvel cartoon people, okay, or Marvel comic people, maybe you might see the connection there. So anyway, aside from African Americans, we also saw groups set up for Nisei or Asian Americans, or in this case, Japanese Americans. The 100 Infantry Battalion and the 402nd Regimental Combat Team were some of the most decorated soldiers during World War II. They took a brunt of punishment during the war. And part of that was these men were Nisei. A lot of them came from the internment camps, and they wanted to prove their loyalty to the United States. Kind of on a side note, I want to talk about Ben Kuroki here. Ben Kuroki was a Nebraskan. He was actually born out by Cozad, a little bit by Golfenberg out there in that region of Nebraska, and spent a lot of time growing up around Hershey, North Platte, that vicinity. And what I think is interesting is that when the attack happened on Pearl Harbor, Ben Kuroki and his brothers, they took off to Grand Island, and they found the Army recruiter, and the Army recruiter said, "Yep, you can come on in." And he ended up being one of the first Japanese Americans to get into the U.S. Army. What's interesting is his family was never interned, but yet he was always kind of fighting the stereotypes that were out there. He went in and had been kind of put into like clerical work, doing like office work, and he kept demanding that he could, you know, be doing a little bit more for the war effort. And when he was in Europe, he got an opportunity to join a bombing squadron that were flying like B-24 Liberators, and he actually was a turret bomber, which was basically, or a turret gunner, which basically the turret is the gun that is at the bottom of the aircraft, and it's probably one of, out of all the gunning positions on an aircraft, that's probably the most vulnerable and most likely where a person is going to get wounded. And he flew the minimum 25 missions over parts of Europe, and decided that he wanted to go for more, and he pleaded with the Army Air Corps to get an opportunity to fly on missions in the Pacific, and he became the only Japanese American to actually go on bombing campaigns over Japan. Okay, when the war ends, he goes to the University of Nebraska, gets his degree in journalism, owns a newspaper in York for many years. Eventually, he owns newspapers and is a journalist in Michigan and eventually California. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross. So, I mean, he certainly was a well-known man, but he faced a lot of resistance from other Nisei who were imprisoned in the internment camps. And that was something that he always had to deal with through the rest of his life. But if you ever get an opportunity, there is a documentary that Nebraska Public Television has on him. It is definitely worth watching. Native Americans also served throughout the U.S. military. They weren't necessarily so much segregated, but we did find a little niche area. And because some Native Americans had actually learned their tribal language, the military saw that as an opportunity to use it as secret codes. And so roughly 14 different Native American nations had code talkers. And probably the most famous and probably the most successful of all the code talkers were the Navajo code talkers, who a lot of them served with the U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. And certainly this was a game changer as far as, helping us with victory. When the war ends, what decision does President Harry Truman make in 1948? And a lot of it is because of the things that we've just heard about. He decides to sign an executive order that's going to fully integrate the armed forces. So no more segregation in the military, which is a wonderful thing. And number 14, what branch in the military was the first to allow women to enlist? And that was the Army. And I want to kind of just briefly go over a little bit of that. Women in the military, women had kind of served in like auxiliary units, primarily in the nursing corps, really during the time of the First World War. But when World War II comes around, there's kind of a push to kind of get women into the regular army. And it is the first time that women can do that, but they can't serve in combat capacities. Women, for the most part, if they did serve in the military, and it doesn't matter if they served in the Army Air Corps or with the Women's Air Force service pilots or the Waves or the Spars or the Marine Corps, they basically were doing things like being nurses. And the thing about being a nurse, if you were a nurse, you could actually serve not only in the military during times of war, but you could serve during peacetime. Okay, which was kind of the unique situation here. Anyone else I'm going to mention as far as roles were only allowed in the military during times of war, and that were like linguists, mechanics, telephone operators, secretaries, cooks, and forecasters, weather forecasters. So, women for the most part got opportunities that they hadn't had before, and certainly opened the door for women in the future as far as their role and capacity within the military. All right. Thank you very much.